I didn't start out as a Linux system administrator. I didn't start out as a software developer. I didn't start out with those limitations. So I never thought about the things I did to be role specific. That point is important because and it's like, all right, you get to install this operating system. And I remember back then, they did a lot of work to try to make it look like Windows. Like that whole KDE desktop experience, like, oh, Open Office, Microsoft Office. And so you get this thing installed, and the first thing I thought about was like, how can this be free? And so now just taking something I learned in the open source community and showing people that we could do this too as a company, kind of started my journey on the sharing. Hey, we're going to maintain a fork for these reasons. But then something happens where Upstream does something so different that the fork becomes stale. And now you can't even benefit from those changes. Oh, also, some of those changes are key security changes. Also, some of those changes allow you to use the new hardware. So you still want to stay with this fork or not?
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where we discuss all the things about the mechanics of open source in business and in communities. Follow the podcast on your favorite platform and check out season 2 episodes with Samson Gotti,
Open source is interesting.
Claire Dillon,
Great collaboration,
Wayne Starr,
Freedom,
Stephen Wally,
Good engineering,
Austin Bryan,
community,
Tom Sadler,
collaboration,
Federico Gonzalez Waite,
limitless,
Amanda Brock,
the future,
Gregory Kurtzer,
collaborative,
Michael Dexter,
freedom,
and Kelsey Hightower.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
Thank you, Kelsey, for being here with us on the podcast. And I'm super excited to dive into your open source journey and experiences that you had throughout the years. But before we go there, I would like to learn a bit about your background to understand a little bit where you're coming from. Can you share a little bit about, your tech background and also what do you do now?
Man, the background. I feel like I tell this story a lot and I always get to self-reflect every time you think about it and every time you tell it. And look, I think a lot of people, you just find your way into tech the way you find your way into tech. For me, it was deciding not to go to college, buying an A+ certification, and just approaching the beginnings of my career with, it's on me. If I want to take the time to learn something, I can go do that. And then every once in a while, decide that I can learn something else, which just increases the number of opportunities I've been exposed to. For 25 years, that formula has worked out magnificently well. From private enterprises, financial services, small companies, startups, and large companies like the likes of Google. And so a lot of my career has been this idea that I'm in control over a lot of it. And so for the longest time, when I first started my career, I was an entrepreneur. I looked at all those HR job postings, was like, I don't have 50 years of mainframe experience. I don't know what AIX is. I can spell it, but I've never used it before. So in 1999, 2000, that stuff was out of reach for just a normal person. At least for me, they were still shipping CDs and magazines so you can try out a Linux distribution. And so for me, a lot of that stuff was unattainable. So I started a small computer shop right in the hometown, maybe 20 minutes south of Atlanta, Jonesboro, Georgia. And I paid $1,000 a month. And I opened up this small storefront that was backed by this consultancy that did service calls for small insurance companies. But at that point, you did whatever was necessary. If someone asks, can you hook up this Xerox printer? The default answer is yes. If there's a manual, if there's someone who's ever done it before, and remember, this is kind of pre Google search being a thing. It probably existed, but I didn't use it. And so at that point, you're really reading every page of the manual. NetBUI versus TCP/IP, like those were the choices back then. And so you just learn to overcome and solve the problem what was in front of you. I didn't start out as a Linux system administrator. I didn't start out as a software developer. I didn't start out with those limitations. So I never thought about the things I did to be role specific. That point is important because when I do get my first W-2 job where you get a paycheck like clockwork, they take the taxes out for you, you can almost count on it showing up and you get to just focus on a specific role. I always found that it's like the easiest thing in the world. All you want me to do is just this one job. That's it. I don't have to invoice anyone. I don't have to collect payment. I don't have to think about paying other people, just me and this task. And so during my career, I've always found it like, hey, what else can I learn? What does that role do? Shouldn't we know how to do that as well? And I think the last thing that really shapes my career is that I never accepted this concept of we just use these tools. I meet a lot of people and they will say, I use Terraform. And that's the limits of their experience. They download it, they install it, they follow the style guide, end of story. But for me, I'm the type of person that when it doesn't work, when a flag does something that I don't expect it should do, or I run into a bug, my first thought is, you should be able to fix that, right? How's it work? And back in my day, I started with like Ruby and Python. So you could literally just see the source code right there on your machine. And you would just go there and grep your way into the error message and then try to patch it in place, run it again. And if it worked, you're like, oh, that seems to work. And then I learned about this whole, you can push the changes upstream and not just keep it for yourself.
Did you ever regret not going to college?
No, because at some point you realize all that stuff is just a point in time. Like when I really sat and thought about it, if you went to college in 1970 for computer science, that doesn't make you equipped to understand the internet better than I can. You may have the foundational knowledge about how electricity works and that gets turned into packets that get sent on the wire. You may understand some CS things, but the idea of a web browser talking to a web server using Apache web server, for a lot of people, these big checkpoints are kind of like resets, right? So some people stop learning. You may have went to school in the 70s and you may have checked out for the last 30 years. Year 2000 rolls around and you're like, I don't know what this web thing's all about. I started loading tapes into some mainframe. So I think it's one of these things where, and the reason why I know this is true, Kubernetes came out when I was like 33 years old. And it was a reset for me as well. I came from Puppet, Chef, Ansible, config management. And so when Kubernetes came out, I remember just diving in. Now, one thing I think I would have benefited from going to college is like, what are these scheduling algorithms? What is bin packing? There's some core fundamental concepts that have been the same for decades. So when a lot of people saw Kubernetes as this new approach to doing things, you could just go back to a white paper by Leslie Lamport and you would have known that there's only a few ways in the world to think about consensus and why it's important in a distributed system. I don't know if I regretted it, but I understand the value of fundamental knowledge. And so I started to make sure that I understood the fundamentals and not just the software.
I was going to say, so did you specifically hunt that out to fill out your experience and your knowledge base?
100%. I think long ago, I learned to be a historian. Like some people look at a thing and complain, it doesn't do this, versus why does it do what it currently does? And a lot of times you can go back to the mailing list. You can see people debating this decision. Should we use 128-bit encryption or should we go to 512-bit? And someone says, look, you could do that, but it's just going to thrash your CPU. And most of our customers don't have hardware acceleration. So you can make that decision for the sake of security, but the trade-off is bad for people. So we're going to default to 128. Now, look, 10 years later, it may be deemed that that is no longer a best practice, but it takes time to roll out a default flag because that's an unexpected change and make break things. So when I approach things like Kubernetes, I read the RAF paper, and that was recently written, a new take on distributed consensus and how you would solve it. But then you go backwards and say, well, what were people doing before this? Oh, the Google folks were all about Paxos, and that was kind of complicated. And then Leslie Lamport talked about this in various ways by studying biology and how things were interacting in nature and how you could solve some of these problems or at least approach them in the time and space that you have. So I guess I learned my lesson there is like, hey, there's hardly anything that's net new, but there is a different take on things because networks get faster, CPUs get faster, storage gets faster. So bad algorithms from back in the day are now decent algorithms because you have the right trade-offs in place.
As we are going into history, do you remember when you first learned about the concept of free and open source software?
Yeah, I think when I was really getting into tech, and I remember coming out of that kind of entrepreneurship, the world was kind of dominated by Windows and DOS. And, some of the biggest things you would do were just hooking up Windows networking because it was so complex. Setting up an Exchange server, right? This is when people used to host the Exchange server in the building and try to back things up. And when I was really like, hey, I wanted to go into industry, I noticed that a lot of the job requirements were Unix based. And I don't even know where you could buy AIX. Like there was like, you don't go to Amazon to buy AIX. This thing came with your LPAR or your mainframe. It's like, it was very inaccessible. But I was like, well, what is AIX? What is Solaris? These are Unixes. And you say, oh, what's Unix? And then you go look around and it's like, hey, the history behind Unix is very complex. You got the AT&T folks doing their thing. Then you have the BSDs, which try to implement this, but then they get into some legal weirdness. But then there's this distro called FreeBSD. And I'm like, free sounds like the right price for me. That's what I got. And so you get FreeBSD and you have to install it. And so you find that old hardware, that old HP Proliant computer thing you have on your desk or that gateway computer, they're not even in business anymore. And you stick the CD in and it's like, all right, you get to install this operating system. And I remember back then, they did a lot of work to try to make it look like Windows. Like that whole KDE desktop experience, like, oh, Open Office, Microsoft Office. And so you get this thing installed. And the first thing I thought about was like, how can this be free? There must be some trade-off we're making. Who would ever have this philosophy? Because, I grew up in America. Anytime you create value, you must try to exercise maximum return and make money. Microsoft was making money at that time. Bill Gates is the richest person in the world, largely because of the software game. So who was these other people? And I think my first encounter was with never met the person, but Richard Stallman. And I was just reading the story about Richard Stallman's kind of crusade at MIT of like, hey, this whole userland component. And I remember they were sticking to this concept of GNU Linux. Like if you just say Linux, you were missing a big part of the stack. Linus Torvalds did a good job, but you can't just use a kernel. Literally, there's no interface. There's no shell. There's no commands. You need all that other stuff. And when combined, you get this GNU Linux thing. And I was like, oh, so this bash. But it turns out a lot of the proprietary Unix-like utilities, this one person was kind of largely responsible for just making clones of them. And in a way that if you're the BSDs, if you're the kernels, they're debating on which way to go, monolithic versus modular. But you had these user lands that were roughly similar. And so when I started learning FreeBSD, because I thought it was the most pure, I wanted to get closest to history that I could. And the timeline brought me to FreeBSD. And I remember doing my first interview, not at Google. I was at Google 8 years. But before that, I was at Google a time prior. It was like my first non-entrepreneur job. And I remember going to that interview and they were just asking me all of these Linux questions. I mean, it was deep. This thing, that thing. And luckily for me, a lot of the things are roughly the same in terms of user land. But then we started to get into how the kernel deals with things like threads, how the kernel manages memory, the Linux file system interface, virtual versus actual file systems. And I was like, look, I don't know. But if you're talking about FreeBSD, Macworld all the way up, that's my game. And boy, did I hit the jackpot. There's 3 interviewers at this thing, and they're just grilling you. And I look and I said FreeBSD, and one of the interviewers' faces lit up. He was like, oh, FreeBSD, you say? And I looked down and he had the FreeBSD mascot is Beastie, like this little devil with horns with the, pitchfork. and he had that tattooed on his calf. I was like, oh, the stars are aligned. And FreeBSD folks, they are a tribe. Everybody, you ain't running FreeBSD unless you exactly know what you're doing. And when I said that, and he started asking me about FreeBSD, the interview quickly pivoted to a what do you know, to like this geek out session of extreme validation. So that was kind of my first encounter with this whole free and open source. Free as in speech, not as in beer. And it's one of these things where it's like there's a deep philosophy behind this, because at the same time I was becoming a minimalist and I was challenging my own relationship with the materialistic world. And to see this software movement align with that resonated at multiple levels.
So you realized that the software was available, and you could download, you can install, and you can play with it. When did you actually get involved? Like, how was the journey in between? How can this thing be free versus getting involved in a community and participating and working with the people?
I think when you first learn about like open source, that is your initial membership, because you can't teach other people, you can't contribute until you get initiated. And so when you open that first book, it's like that's when it starts. Now, what do you do with it? Because sometimes the simplest thing you can do is report a problem. I remember the first contribution I made was not code, it wasn't literature, it was monetary in nature. The FreeBSD team and the OpenBS team, they typically maintain these like we need hardware lists. Like there's a like, hey, it will be nice if we had access to this Intel network card so we can test drivers. And so what you would do is you would go to this wish list and you would just buy the stuff and send it to them. And I think the first thing I sent to was someone named Theo Durat. I think he was over OpenBSD. I hope I have his name correct. And he had this list. And I'm sitting here like, this person is maintaining all this value for people like me. The least I could do is send him a few items off this list, because if he gets them, then he just makes the operating system better. So that was like my first contribution. Like, based on my skill set at the time, I had more, I don't want to say more money than skill, but that was kind of where I was. So I did what I could do. But then I remember I was working at a company called Pier One. They did web hosting. They're spin out a Rackspace. And I know you all are involved with the OpenStack project. And so you got this little company that had a different take on web hosting, fully automated. You go to a web browser, you click a few buttons, and then you would basically form this request that would configure the RAID controller, get your hard drive where it would set up. And then within an hour, you got this web server with an IP address. And so I joined this web hosting company, and everything was pretty much open source. MySQL, maybe Plesk wasn't, but everything around it was. And you just had to know the whole stack. You could get a phone call and someone would say, hey, my website isn't working. You better know PHP. You better know MySQL. You better know the whole thing, because you got about 10 minutes to diagnose, troubleshoot, and get a resolution before it's on to the next call. And I remember this is when, I don't know if cloud was becoming a big thing, but virtualization definitely was coming a big thing. And so you had the likes of VMware, but I remember there was a project called Zen. And there was a white paper, Zen and the Art of Virtualization. And I remember reading it and coming to work and setting up a server running Zen. And I was showing the Pier One people, it's like, look, we're giving people all these physical servers, and we're bound by how much literal rack space we have and ping, pipe, and power. Once you exhaust that, that's it. But what if you could give people like a VPS? And Zen looks like a good way of doing that with some of the stuff Intel was doing with the VTX instructions, and you get hardware level of security. And I remember setting this thing up. And I think that was my second contribution, because spreading knowledge of what's possible, I think it's like the other cornerstone. So I remember people crowding around my cubicle, and I just had this server. I went to the storage room where we keep some of the backup servers. I pulled it out, and those things sound like jet engines when you turn them on in an open, like those 1Us, those fans are so small, they make so much noise. And I remember having this jet engine take off at the cubicle, and people are like, what the hell is this? What are you doing? And why are the lights dimming? Because you're drawing all of this power. And I remember I was like, dude, I got this virtualization thing. You can just create servers without physical servers. And people's minds were blown. And so now just taking something I learned in the open source community and showing people that we could do this too as a company, kind of started my journey on the sharing. And now I'll get to the contribution part. So we're about 5 years into kind of this W-2 employee type career. I'm bouncing around companies. Every time I learn something, it just makes me more attractive in the market. Literally, salary increases every single time. So now I'm addicted to this feedback loop and I'm studying everything. Anything I can get my hands on, I want to know how it works. And so I joined this company called TSYS, and they're doing financial services, high regulation, and you're not using open source unless it's being bought by Red Hat or IBM. Other than that, all bets are off. And I remember I wanted to push the bar on, actually, Python was probably my first product. I was going to get to Puppet, but I'll come back to that one. That company's using lots of mainframe, and lots of people sit around and complain, oh, mainframe, we're dinosaurs, we're old. And something told me, like, you should go figure out why the mainframe exists. And I remember driving down with a couple of members of my team to Columbus, Georgia, and they were like, this is the mainframe. You can walk in it. There's a little bench in there. You can sit down. And we were talking about reliability, and we were explaining to them how we were using like these Dell 1U servers and running Linux and how we use Nagios for monitoring. They're like, what's Nagios? I was like, oh, we put these agents on there and they detect when the servers go down and then we can fix them. He was like, servers go down? I was like, yeah, they go down all the time. You can run out of disk space. You know, these cheap things, they burn out. There's all kind of things that happen. So when that happens, we have Nagios and then we jump right on it. We're really good. And then one dude was just really getting at us. He was like, I can't believe you guys, how you even tolerate this? And then we were kind of feeling a little bad. And his buddy jumped in to like correct him. He's like, hey, our systems went down too before. He's like, oh, you're right. 12 years ago, we did have an outage. And we're sitting there like, it's getting worse. How reliable? And then you see the thing, redundant motherboards, CPUs,
Mission
ARM that
critical.
moves bad disk drives out of the way. We're like, we don't have nothing like that. And then we started talking about how data is processed on the mainframe. And this is when my eyes lit up. He's like, Kelsey, look, you guys are just not doing a bad job, but it's very naive. When you get a packet of data, you all take a credit card and you stuff it 8 bits per integer, and you just wasting memory. And that's why you guys are buying servers with all of this memory and you're still slower at processing stuff than the mainframe. I was like, well, what makes it different? He's like, do you know what a nibble is? I'm like, what's a nibble? It's half a byte. You can express a lot of this stuff in a byte. Oh, you guys are using XML for what? You're literally wasting a bunch of characters in processing. Here's EBCDIC. Fixed length fields. If you start at byte 16 and you go over this number of bytes, that's the credit card number. And it's packed deeply, so packed decimal. And so I'm starting to learn this, and then I'm contributing libraries to our Python stack. Hey guys, if we're going to convert this stuff from COBOL to Python, we got to understand EBCDIC. We got to understand packed decimal. There's no way that we can just do this with XML. It's going to slow everything down, and the mainframe can't understand it.
And that was part of your gig, was actually doing porting from COBOL to Python?
No, I was a Linux system administrator. That's the key. I was a Linux system administrator managing, the transition from mainframe to Linux. But when you realize that the OS isn't the problem, it's the process. A data file comes in, Control M schedule this on a machine. You have to parse the actual file. If your code doesn't understand EBCDIC and packed decimal, then you're like, oh, just send it to the mainframe. Why are people saying send it to the mainframe? It's just an array of bytes. And so as a Linux system administrator, you step up and say, hey, can I try? And then you figure out why people keep trying to avoid processing this thing. So say, you know what? I know a little bit of Python. Maybe I can try it. But then you have to go learn all these other things. And then you end up wearing another hat. That's the entrepreneur mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, we can pre-process these files ahead of time. We're just going to have to write some libraries. And so that was like my first, we can build what we need. And so I created a packed decimal library. I created something that understood EBCDIC, and then you can import it in Python. And then we could start converting some of those COBOL jobs into Python. And they ran just fine, but you needed that step. So that's kind of what I mean by just going above and beyond. So that wasn't the job I was hired for. It was just a thing of like, hey, the Linux servers are fully automated. We got Pixie Boot, Kickstart profiles. That's easy. I could just sit back and wait on Jira tickets, or I can get involved. And I think that's what a lot of the open source ethos is about, the transparency of seeing a problem and then taking software and doing what's necessary to solve the problem. And then you get bonus points when you choose to share the solution with other people. And so that to me is like the core of open source to me. How you apply it is how we get to all these fancy projects and such. And so those were my first contributions. And then Python had a bug. As I was packaging things up, I was like, Python eggs versus pip packages versus that. I'm like, what are we doing? This utils versus this didn't work with this version of Python. I was like, packaging is chaos in the Python community back in 2005, maybe. And I started contributing. I went upstream, was like, hey, I saw some Python proposals to improve packaging. The goal is to try to unify some of these things. Disutils to virtual vim. There was a tool called pip to manage these dependencies. And there was a lot of open issues. And I was like, you know what? If I jump in and help, we can use some of these features for what we're trying to do at work. So I kind of focused my contributions on speeding up the packaging process or some of the features so we could use them. And so that was my contributions back to the broader community. And it was tricky because we couldn't really do open source at work. So you have to go home, contribute at nighttime, get it merged upstream. And then once it's merged upstream, then you can go back to work and just pull it in and be like, yeah, no open source work here. And so that was kind of the issue where it's really hard to do this kind of stuff when maybe your employer at the time isn't 100% on board.
Do you have the experience of getting into an argument with anyone in the corporate world in terms of like working upstream as opposed to creating a fork or just mindlessly blocking employees from being able to get involved upstream?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I call them arguments. Like at CoreOS, do we contribute to Docker or do we just start Rocket, which was a competing container runtime at the time? And so you would say, look, we need to stick with Docker because that's the ecosystem. While we're right about systemd having more capabilities as something that can manage processes over where Docker was at the time, should we really have Rocket? And look, we did it anyway. But then we deprecated it and it made sense full circle. And so one thing I've learned as I matured over time is that being right is not as important as getting consensus. So if people have some fear about whether we merge our changes upstream or keep a proprietary fork, that's a point in time decision. And so I usually just write down what I think is true and maybe why I disagree, because what I've noticed is things will change. Like, hey, we're going to maintain a fork for these reasons. But then something happens where upstream does something so different that the fork becomes stale. And now you can't even benefit from those changes. Oh, also, some of those changes are key security changes. Also, some of those changes allow you to use the new hardware. So you still want to stay with this fork or not? And now you have another point in time to revisit this. And so to me now, I think about these things as just temporary checkpoints. I'm right, but won't win today. We'll revisit this in 2 years. But also, I always have this phrase I used to say, different company, same team. I don't need to be right here. I can go somewhere else and work on what I want to work on. The reason why I left Puppet Labs was largely because I think I was right about something at the wrong time. At that point, most of the config management automation tools were written in Perl, Python, or Ruby. End of story. That was it. Golang comes out. And I'm like, whoa, it solves a lot of issues. We don't have to distribute this runtime separate from the actual thing we're running. No global lock interpreter, so we can actually do things with multiple threads. Who could imagine? And the usability of a single binary was mind-blowing to me. And I remember refactoring one of Puppet's core components called Factor. So in order for configuration management to work, you need to know something about the node. And this little component written in Ruby would just gather facts and send it to the server so you can make decisions. If Red Hat, yum, install Apache, no problem. But Factor requires Ruby to be on the server. So you got to install Ruby first just to have Factor do anything. And so what version of Ruby do you have? Aha, that's tricky. Because if it's a Red Hat box, you could have an older version of Ruby than the latest release of Ubuntu. So as an engineer, I got to focus on both versions of Ruby. And also sometimes I can't even use something that would make things better because the older systems don't have the version of Ruby I need. So you just can't do it. So Go comes out and you can distribute statically linked binaries. That changes the landscape. We can support a cascading array of systems, including things like network switches, where you may not even be able to load Ruby runtime on it. So I wrote this thing, and people were like, no, we can't be using Go because it doesn't work on Solaris. Here's a Solaris and AIX rendering its head again. Doesn't work on those, so we can't adopt it. And I'm sitting there like, what? And then Docker comes out, written in Go. Terraform comes out, written in Go. etcd comes out, a key value store database written in Go. I'm like, guys, the world has changed. And that wasn't something they wanted to do, so I left. And part of me leaving, I open sourced my first project, the first major project, CompD. It was a configuration system, lightweight, that leveraged Go, pulled its values from etcd, and just did things in a different way given the world of containers and soon to be world of Kubernetes. I knew in that new world, we weren't going to be copying files to individual servers anymore. These things would be way more self-contained. And all you would need to do then is really focus on the config file, not how you install apps. So maybe that was a dispute that I think I lost. I don't know if it was an argument, but I did try. I showed the evidence. I built the prototypes. I thought I told the best story I could. But the world's a big place. So I left to pursue it.
I think that's a very important thing that you're pointing to, and I do share that experience, and it's a very interesting way to look at it. Like, I could think about my days at Ericsson where I talk about what I failed with as a failure, or I could look at it that I wasn't wrong. What I was saying, it was right. But in that department at that particular point in time, the people were not ready. And the department, that part of the company wasn't ready, and things were not lining up well, not about who failed with what. So I think that's
The truth is,
very good.
the Puppet Labs team made a good decision. Do you know how hard it would be to, now you got to maintain both stacks for a number of years. It's just not that easy where you get to just, even if a new idea shows up, that you get to retrofit it. And I think that's the struggle of open source, because open source is continuously making changes upstream, solving various needs of the world. And sometimes you have to consider backwards compatibility. But in open source, we get the ability to start brand new projects that have no ties back to the way we currently do things. And not everyone's going to be on the same opportunity train to take advantage of those. So you got to find your way. So I think it worked out well for everybody involved, including me.
I've been starting to think about this lately, and I've come to this theory. So let me bounce it off of you, and you tell me what you think. You know, companies that are just beginning the open source journey, those that are advocates of open source inside of the company are saying, you really should use this stuff. It's really worthwhile. It's as secure as everything else. You should really use this stuff, and then they have success. And so the company starts to use that code. And then shortly after that, they go, well, you needed to make these changes, or you found these bugs, you should contribute those back. You should contribute those back. And there's resistance. No, I don't want to do that. No, I'm going to work just on my stuff. So, eventually, finally, that bug fix, they finally contributed back, and okay, good. And then, well, we wanted this feature, and we shouldn't just do this feature. We should try to work with the community and get that feature pushed upstream, because that's value to them. And we should do that as good community members. And so, the advocate pushes for that. And finally, the company says yes. And then the guy goes, okay, well, now you've contributed all these things, but this is actually additional overhead for the project. So you should help review all the other code as well. So it's like every time you convince the company to do something in open source, it leads to another thing that they have to do more of. And so if I'm a manager, who's been walking this journey over time, it's like, when does this incessant need of these open source projects ever end for me? Now, you and I and Ildiko, we know the other side of that, and we've just talked about it. But if I put my empathy hat on for those poor managers in the companies, that's what they've been seeing. And I'm curious, what is your take on that view of the world?
Well, we actually had this discussion a lot at Google. Kubernetes was exactly that. TensorFlow, to some degree, is that. Prometheus, even though it wasn't our project, is that.
Right.
Because these things now become these commercial things we depend on. And so the arguments were very similar. We got all these people working on open source upstream, and then we have high-paying customers that would like things to be done in the managed service, right? We did the value, right? We put the value where it belongs, in the service and the manageability, and not necessarily in the software. And so the customer's like, yo, where is that IAM integration? Where is that custom encryption key integration stuff? And it's like, well, we're working on upstream. So the minute a manager hears that, it's like, whoa. We need to rebalance these resources, right? Because if you're telling me you can't do the thing that literally pays you, I can't justify you all working upstream and this stuff is falling on the wayside because we literally need money to pay you. So it's complicated. And then I think one thing that the team started getting really smart about was being very clear. We are working on the commercial integration. The IAM thing requires hooks inside of Kubernetes so that we can actually manage every aspect of Kubernetes. Because if you layer authorization on top without the core components doing their thing, then it won't work. So this thing we're working on upstream, and the reason why we're reviewing all these other things is because we got to bring those things in. And if they're not secure, and if they're not right, then we're going to be running them in production. So if this new feature causes performance problems, it's going to cause performance problems for us. And then that leads to these other issues. And I think it is on engineering to include open source contributions in the overall roadmap. And I think that transparency helps a manager realize and say, listen, yes, we should contribute to open source. Contribute, not own, right? And we got to balance it out. So if you tell me that we have 60% of these things we need to generate revenue, run the money, and then these 40% contribute to those, then this is easy, right? It's just that some of our works happens upstream. But when you start to show me a feature that we don't need, I think it is fair for a manager to say, hey, look, that's a net new thing. It's a pet project of yours. On your own time, sure. But looking at this list of things you would like to contribute, we like these 8. These 7 don't really align, and you haven't given me justification to really rationalize the allocations we're given as a company. And I think that is just fair, right? Engineer, manager, and the upstream project. I think what gets in trouble is that we don't communicate our bandwidth allocations upstream, because what happens is big companies end up taking over these projects, right? They get all these contributions, everyone's relying on them, they're doing all of this work, and then they have to need to dial it back for some reason, right? Maybe they have a code red, they need to pivot these people to work on some critical security things so they can remain in business, and then things drop and there's no communication. It's okay to say, listen, we got to start working on some internal stuff for the next 6 months. So our ability to review stuff is going to drop way down. Matter of fact, we're going to recommend a project freeze. I remember when Golang did it. I think I remember when Python was doing it from the transition to 2 to 3. And see, no one wants to hear this kind of stuff. But I do think it's important to say, hey, we don't have the bandwidth right now. So for the next 6 months, from January or July to December, we're kind of going freeze mode. So security stuff only, minor bug fixes only, and all features are going to be frozen until next year so we can reassess. In that time, we're going to start training new maintainers.
Yeah.
So if you want to step up and learn these subsystems, it's going to be much easier during the freeze versus when everything is moving around. So this is our plea for help. We don't want to be the bottleneck. And these are just like the nuanced discussions that I don't know if we all have enough. It's like my manager said no, and you just disappear. And it's just crickets on the issues, and then things start getting stale. You got to just communicate. It's like, hey, and don't throw your manager on the bus. So if you're listening to this, I'm not saying you go to your project and say, my manager hates you and open source, and that's why I can't contribute anymore. Don't do that. That's not fair. Just be like, hey, I work for money, and the fair thing to do after some rational discussion is we got to reallocate things. So here's what my participation will be going forward. And to me, even when HashiCorp changed their license, one of the first things I said on Twitter is I appreciated the 10 years of the way HashiCorp has been giving us all of this value for most of y'all for essentially free. You have to appreciate the previous 10 years before you can complain about things going forward. So it's just a balance.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good approach to it. I think it's often the case that those developers, when they are put in that situation, shift to nights and weekends on their own, and that's when you hear so much about the burnout, because they do feel so responsible. And it's a parent-child relationship almost, right? You want your baby to survive, and so you want to continue to have it thrive, and you do those reviews outside, and that ultimately is not good for the individuals.
I've seen a
yeah,
lot
I
of
mean,
maintainers do this to themselves. You start getting success and that feedback loop feels good. Thousands of users, GitHub stars are going up. People know your name. People are using your stuff. But then you got to realize that what is your succession plan? You're not going to do this forever. You're not going to want to do this forever. I remember there's a guy named Ben Johnson, and he wrote the first etcd implementation, or the RAF implementation used by etcd. And Ben Johnson was just like super popular, especially when Go was just heating up. And I remember he did this new project and he put on the top, I will not be accepting contributions. I know my bandwidth and I don't have bandwidth for this one to be managed like the other ones. So I'm going to publish my stuff here. I'm going to be respectful of lots of backwards compatibility stuff, but I cannot take your feature request. And it was so fair because it was right there in the README. It was right there in the contribution guide. Like, hey, don't go off and do a bunch of stuff and expect me to review and merge it. I'm telling you right now, that's not going to happen. So I think that balance is just super clear and healthy thing to do. And you got to know when to pass the baton.
Yeah. I think it's important. I think it's one of the things that's missing. We need to make sure that the community knows this through messaging time and time again.
I think one of the things that we are not stressing enough is, one, to set your boundaries, and the other one is to have clear and transparent communication about it. Like how Kelsey, you were talking about, I don't have the bandwidth for XYZ, or the project is going into freeze. And at the same time, like if it's a community and there's a freeze, I think that's a great point of reminding people that if you're wanting to get up to speed and catch up, this is really the time to do it, because the project is not marching forward. So on one hand, we are communicating about we don't have the bandwidth, so more bandwidth would be great. And also reminding people that this is a great time if you want to be involved because you care about this thing, like do it now.
But I think we're humans. Like, people sometimes neglect their own health, even though they know better. Some people know they should be changing those filters in their house, but they don't. This is one of these things where it's really hard to be on top of your game all the time and forever. And so I don't know if these open source projects present a realistic view of how humans maintain anything, how we maintain our relationships, how we maintain our bodies. Sometimes you just go through a period where you're not in the best mood possible. That's probably the wrong time to be trying to work on some new feature that you don't even need. And so how do you communicate the ebbs and flows of being a human? And these projects are very weird because most people, we say community, but we're not really talking about the whole person. We're talking about the person writing code and using the code. But when you start to zoom out and you really want to mean community, that means there's a little bit more to this. That person, how do they feel? Like, I guess it's not cordial to keep greeting people, but most people don't even say hi anymore or smile anymore. Like, these things are so important. So I understand now why we keep missing all the human flags. Like, a person just had a kid. Hey, congratulations on the new kid. Would you implement this feature? It's like, what? What are you talking about? Like, no, they got something more important to be working on right now. So I think it's just one of those things where this software thing is so much closer to like reality when you really expand out. And I hope we start to really think about this stuff in terms of seasons and people, transition and change. And consistency comes with a huge price, and someone's got to pay it. And it just may not be you forever.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. It's so interesting that we are talking about this because I work with a few communities and a few community managers, and we are currently in the process of taking these topics to some of our communities, like just really highlighting this importance of communication and just the really simple things of saying hi, please, thank you, how are you today, like taking care of the communities as a collection of human beings as opposed to the little robots who type code every day and review code every day, like how to make the environment nicer, and with that more sustainable, because we are also looking into like the people, looking after the people who are writing that code and maintaining the software, as well as talking to companies, individuals in the ecosystem, like, hey, if this is something you're relying on, you care about, then this is your opportunity to increase that bandwidth and do it on a, like, maintain something for the friction of the cost if it was your proprietary solution and you literally had to do every single thing yourself. So just, yeah, putting things into a different perspective is sometimes it really is needed. Before we depart, Kelsey, can you tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with tech and nothing to do with open source? Any hobby or fun fact?
I think I've kind of told you a lot about me. Like I'm a minimalist and a person who does a lot of self-reflection. I mean, a lot of self-reflection, not the kind to my detriment, but just who am I? As simple as that. And then whatever the answer is that day, just try to challenge it a little bit. Is that who I want to be? And then if that's not the right answer, then I try to move towards it. It's just that simple. So being a minimalist for me is like, why do I own this thing? Is it important? Do I like it, or do I like the fact that other people like it? That is who I am. And it's reflected in everything and my approach to everything. And so, there's lots of fun facts. I like to play Magic the Gathering online. And when I was in high school, I used to look at look at the nerds playing card. What are they doing? But here I am, literally my favorite game. And so um, I'm complex in that way. I just like to appreciate things for what they are, and I try to just be present in the moment. So I don't compare movies to each other, or at least I try not to. And I try to just watch those things for what they are. And I try to just treat life the same way. So maybe people don't know, but it's right there in my Twitter bio. I'm a minimalist, but that's what it means. It's not the cheapest thing. It's the most intentional thing that I sought out there.
As you being a minimalist and constantly reevaluating things, what was the last thing that you left behind? And it doesn't have to be a physical thing.
My job. Because you think about it, my whole career, I spent so much time trying to be good at this thing, investing in this thing, and it had a great return on investment. But it's who I am. So if you say, hey, what do you do? And I would say, oh, I work at Google, or I work at CoreOS, or I do this thing. It became so much of my identity. All of my time would go into it. And so when you leave that behind, it could be very scary. One of my favorite hip hop lines is, I had to get off the boat so I could walk on water. And so it's very comfortable being in this space with these skills and being comfortable that you can do these tasks. But when you let it go, who are you? That some people, you never ask that. Like you could be 50 years old. It's like, who am I? Oh, I had this career. You start speaking about these things. But so now it's like, hey, if I shed that, what remains? And I actually like what I see. And I'm still here. And some people like, not much has changed. So that meant a lot. Even though I turned in the badge, people still see me. So that means I did a good job leading up to that point. So that was the last thing I left behind, was my work identity. It is a much smaller part of who I am. But constantly asking that question is why I was able to do that, or felt comfortable being able to do that. And also getting lucky with financial gain and all these other things. But even then, there are some people who have tons of money and still can't let go of this identity.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget, but bullet, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is a
that's
silver
what you
bullet.
need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that I don't know if you